Greetings, everyone. This is Ahab Ever from the Chronicles of Ahab Ever. And the topic I'm going to be doing now is the question of, was COVID-19 created by Hashem? So I've covered only a few topics. I think I've done like one actual video concerning coronavirus in terms of the halakhic ramifications of how someone who keeps Torah Moshe is required to manage ourselves in this current situation. And I also did a couple of videos about why is there human suffering, where I kind of dealt with this topic a little bit, but I'm going to deal with it in a more direct fashion. And this comes up because I was on a forum not too long ago, and someone was asking, mostly from a religious perspective, how a person can believe in basically a God, if you will, who essentially causes something like COVID-19 or coronavirus to exist. And I'm going to be dealing with this question specifically from a Torah Moshe perspective, to deal with, is it true that the source creation, the thing that caused all of us to be here, which in Torah language we call Hashem, whether or not Hashem is responsible for the current situation with COVID-19. So one of the reasons that this topic comes up is because of a question that someone may ask from a particular text from the Tanakh about whether or not Hashem creates good and evil. So the particular text that is usually quoted for this idea of whether or not Hashem creates good and evil comes from a section of the Tanakh called Yeshayahu, Perek Mem He, which would be like verse 45. And essentially, what I'll do is I'll read through the text, and then when we get to the bottom, I'll explain what exactly is going on here. Because what's key here is context, meaning that you would have to start at the beginning of this particular section to understand what any one line in it means. So starting here at the very beginning at Aleph, which is the very first section of Memhe, or of 45, it says, Ko Omar Adonai limshicho lechorash asher hahazakti v'mino l'rad lefanov ha'joyim ומאופני מלוכים אפתח לפתוח לפניו דלתיים ושערים לא יסחרו. Continues, it says, אני לפניך אלך והדורים אשר דלתות נחושו אשבר וברכי ברזל הרדע. Continues, ונתתי לך ארצות חושך ומטמוני מסתורים למען תדע כי אני אדוני הקורא ושמך אלוהי ישראל למען עבדי יעקב וישראל בחירי ואגרו לך בשמך אחדנך ולא ידעתני אני אדוני ואין עוד זולתי אין אלוהים עזרך ולא ידעתני למען ידעו ממזרח שמש וממערבו כי אפס בלעדי אני אדוני ואין עוד יוצר אור ובורא חושך ועושה שלום ובורא רג אני אדוני עושה כל אלה. So essentially, when we start at the very beginning, what this is basically discussing is that a particular king named Chorash was basically being told that he was basically, if you will, selected by Hashem or anointed by Hashem, and it's actually mentioned that he was a Mashiach, which is an important point based on some of the other videos you've seen I've done, where he's literally called a Mashiach, because it says Lim Shiho. So what is being explained to Chorash is that he would be able to basically take on other nations and basically win. It mentions that the almost like the doors and the gates would be opened up to him and nothing would be closed to him. And essentially, one of the things explained is that Hashem is explaining that only Hashem is the one doing this, and only Hashem is able to do this, and that there are no other powers out there that would cause this to happen for him. Now, what's of importance here is taking all that into context. One of the last lines near the bottom, the second to last line, what it mentions is that basically he would understand that Hashem alone is the one who is giving him the ability to make this happen. And that's when we get into the last line, which comes to the question that was being asked earlier, where it's in English you would say it's verse 7, where it says, Yotzer or Uvore Hoshech, Ose Shalom, Uvore Rag, Ani Adonai Ase Chol Eila. So this is the part that comes up as a question mark for some, because what it essentially translates into is that Hashem almost like forms, or Yotzer is a particular type of creation, where it's almost like, I guess one way of looking at it would be like saying you're taking materials that exist and creating them into something. And then the next line it says Uvorei Hoshech. So Uvorei Hoshech is almost like creating out of something that where there's nothing there. So something out of nothing, if you will, like where there's essentially nothing to start off with. And then the next line says Oseh Shalom. So it's almost like making or doing Shalom. And Shalom in Hebrew doesn't mean peace. Usually the way people think it means in just a literal translation in English. Usually Shalom is dealing with completeness. It's just like I said, the Hebrew language works on three letter roots, and you'd have to understand these three letter roots in order to understand this text. And then it continues in the last part, Uvorei Ora. And that's like basically creating like one way, because some people say evil, but also like something that's bad or against the proper situation, if you will. And it says Ani Hashem Aseh Chol Eila. So essentially, it's like the best way to understand this would be like saying that all things are in the hands of Hashem, whether they be good or bad. But the interesting thing here is that the words used to define the good things, for example, are defined using two separate words, where everything that's considered to be a bad thing or the opposite of good comes with a different word, and we'll discuss now what that means. So essentially, if we look at this, so remember we were reading earlier, it says that Hashem Yotzer Or. So it's like basically that the light is being formed, and of course light has different meanings in the Torah, but essentially it's like the proper situation. And then it later says I'll say Shalom. So these are the two optimal situations that human beings were created to receive from Hashem, meaning essentially light, and then also completeness, for example. So essentially, this is the things that Hashem creates from known things, and essentially the opposite of those two things is uvorei hoshech, uvorei ro. And essentially, we're told that ani Adonai aseh chol eila. So again, as I was mentioning before, in the Hebrew language, the concept of yotzer or aseh shalom isn't strictly like, in a sense, like the concept that people have in English, where it's like, okay, created and to make. Okay, done. No, the words have more meaning than that. And this is something that's explained in the language the same way that borei, choshech, uvorei, ora, is not just simple like, a creation of darkness, creation of bad or evil. It's a little bit more complex than that. To further this point, a commentator by the name of Ram Malbim explains when dealing with this issue. He explains in his commentary that when it comes to Yotzer Or Uvoreh Hoshech, he says, "V'yesh hevdel ben b'ri'ah le'yetzira." He says, "B'ri'ah he hotzet etzem hadavar, v'hayetzira he hotzet mikuraim hadavokim bo." And he goes on to explain that basically the issue is that when it's talking about Yotzer, or to Ose, it's basically talking about coming up, creating something being established from something that's already around, something that's already here. So it'd almost be like saying the natural universe as we have it can produce good, can produce the light that's being talked about here. And that the word bara or bore is dealing with something coming from nothing, for example. So when it says hoshech ra, there's a difference between these two situations. So for example, if someone, it was like, let's say, a tzaddik, and was living amongst tzaddikim, meaning someone who is winning more at the Torah more than they lose at it, or more than they choose not to do it, for example. Someone who keeps the standards of reality, if you will, and practices it both in the way that they act and the way that they are, and in the environment they're in. Then that produces the situation where what's around them, what's already established, creates, the perfect ideal situation. But if you have someone who's on the opposite spectrum, it's almost as if they're creating a new situation out of nothing, something that doesn't have to be there and wasn't established to be there. And that's where the specific statement where it says, Ani Hashem, Oseh Kol Ele, it's basically against those who would say that there is this power that controls goodness and power controls badness, and that if you appease the good power, then you can not appease the bad power. Appease the bad power, that essentially Hashem is saying that all things were established by the creator of all things, including the possibilities of either the optimal situation, the best situation, or the bad situation, or the situation that's less desirable. Reviewing other commentaries on this, the Mitzvot David mentions concerning this issue of this pasuk that we are investigating. When he says, "V'ani oseh davar behafuchu, ani yotzer or liYisrael, v'ani borei hoshech leBavel." So he continues with this and basically saying that that the creator of all things is saying that when Israel is in the optimal situation, then he creates, out of the reality, for example, the right perfect situation for the people of Israel, and that would cause eventually the Babylonians to have the bad situation because of their actions. Essentially, that eventually there would be peace, or a completeness for the people of Israel, and there would be bad for the people, for the nation of Babel. And eventually, if we take the concept that the bara, which is what's mentioned for Ra, and also for the Hoshech, if Bavel were to have Hoshech and Ra, essentially it's like saying it came out of nowhere. It's something that comes out of nothing, rather than it coming naturally from the environment. So essentially, it's like if you look at like how the Babylonian Empire fell, and other empires similar to it. A lot of times, if you think about it, you don't have a lot of things written about them where they wrote and said that our mistakes is what caused this to happen. We didn't do the right thing in life, so therefore our kingdoms fell. It just kind of like happened. And there's not a lot of written about, okay, what exactly caused it outside of the fact that they were either not able to maintain their empires, or internally or externally. Now, the next thing is mentioned by the Radak, and he makes a comment of comparing this whole situation we've been discussing concerning someone who, like as an example, is like not eating the proper food. So someone is eating things that are not good for their body, and that causes a certain, that creates, if you will, a certain type of situation because of that. Where if a person is healthy, for example, or keeping themselves healthy in a way, it's almost as if they're attaching themselves to the things that are good, the or, or the light, or they're having the completeness. So essentially, these are the kind of comparisons that are made, and to basically sum these up, it would be like saying that the optimal situation is something that the creator of all things gave humanity from the reality that was created. But he also left the option there for there to be the opposite of those things, essentially for there to be darkness, if you will, or to be bad, that comes out of nowhere if that's what people choose to create. And it's important to note that they're not talking about this specifically from the concept of the way Americans understand the concept of, like, let's say, sin, but it's more of like, for example, not using the reality properly. And we'll get into what that means in just a second. So then this asks the question, okay, well, what are the results? So essentially, if we go back to the Torah in Sefer Shemot, Perik Tet Wav, and also it's Perik, sorry, Pasuk Kaf Wav, and this is in English you would call it Exodus, basically, was it 15, 26. Essentially, what is mentioned is this. So it says, "Voyomer im shemua tishma legol Adonai Elohecho, v'hayoshor be'einav da'aseh, והאזנתו למצוותו ושמרתו כל החובות כל המחלות אשר שמתי במצרים לא אשימו עליך כי אני אדוני רופאך." And essentially translating what this means, this is the statement that the creator of all things made to the people of Israel, to Am Yisrael, when after the time when they left Mitzrayim, our ancestors left Mitzrayim and they got to a place where there wasn't any water. They basically were crying out to Moshe Rabbeinu to provide water. Moshe Rabbeinu prayed to Hashem, and Hashem provided them water. And one of the things that Hashem mentioned to them that if they were to listen to the voice of Hashem, meaning keeping the Torah, in the proper way, and to follow the path of Hashem, to be straightforward in the way that they follow Hashem, to do the mitzvot, and to keep them and guard the laws of the Torah, of the statutes of the Torah, then all of the different like machalot, meaning like the sicknesses and things like that, all the different troubles and challenges that were brought up on Mitzrayim during the 10 plagues, as it's called, or the in Hebrew called the Eser Makot, that happened in Mitzrayim earlier, that wouldn't happen because Hashem would be like the Rofeh, the doctor, to fix the ills of the people. So essentially, this paradigm is established where, in order for the people of Israel to have the optimal situation, the Torah was given. So if the Torah is kept, this if you will, principle of reality was established. If the Torah is kept properly amongst the nation would benefit in these ways and would not have these things happen. The nation doesn't keep the Torah in the proper way, then it's like saying you've created a situation or opened the door to the opposite of those situations, which is the opposite of what things were created to be. Now, further to this situation, in the Talmud, in Seder Nezikin, Mesechot Bava Kama, Perek Aleph, it's mentioned in the following way. It says, Tanaim, Rav Yosef Ma'i Dichtiv, and he's quoting from Shemot Yud Bet, from Exodus 12, ואתם לא תצאו איש מפתח ביתו עד הבוקר כיוון שניתן רשות למשחית אינו מבחין בין צדיקים לרשעים ולא עוד אלא שמתחיל מן הצדיקים תחילו שנאמר, and he's quoting יחזקאל כ"א והחרתי ממך צדיק ורשע. So this portion of the Talmud mentions something very interesting. It says that Rav Yosef essentially brings this idea down from the Torah when the people of Israel, when our ancestors were in Mitzrayim, and they were told, okay, during the time of Passover, of Pesach, that they were to stay in their houses and that they were like to mark the door and things like that and not leave the house until morning. Essentially, he brings down a concept saying that when a decree has come about, something that is the Hoshech or the Ra has come about, that the people who are the tzaddikim, meaning that they are the ones who are properly keeping the Torah correctly, whether they even be the people of Israel keeping the 613 mitzvot, or being the people who are not of the people, of the nations of the world keeping the Sheva mitzvot, the 7 mitzvot of Noach, that if a situation comes about where there's this a situation of choshek, if you will, of almost darkness, using our beginning principles, that there's a situation where if they keep the mitzvot and stay within them, and if there's this mitzvah says stay inside and keep into themselves until morning, then they'll be okay. But essentially, what this Talmud mentions is that when if you will, the test between these situations happens, where this bad thing has come about, if the tzaddikim and the rasha'im are found to be, if you will, in the same situation, in the same position, in the same place, then there's no differentiation made between the tzaddikim and the rasha'im. Now, again, a tzaddik is someone who is keeping the Torah correctly to the maximum amount they can, and it's like they are making less mistakes of the Torah or making less choices to not keep the Torah than they are keeping it. So they're keeping the Torah correctly as much as possible and making fewer mistakes in it. Or Rasha is the opposite. They are making the Torah doing the Torah correctly fewer or smaller amounts of time than they are doing things against the Torah more. So it's like this person is on one side of the spectrum. But the thing is in a situation where a difficult situation is going to come about, there's no differentiation made between the two of them. Essentially, it's like saying that tzaddikim have to establish the reality based on the correct principles. And if they haven't done so, even if they're doing it just for themselves, if they haven't helped the world establish it in the right way, there's no differentiation between the two. Or, if you will, if a warning goes out and says, everybody, stay in your homes till morning, and a tzaddik walks outside and says, I'll be okay, I'm a tzaddik, I do everything correctly, nothing will happen, but the warning has already gone out and said, no, everyone, stay in your houses. There's no differentiation made between the tzaddik and the rasha. The rasha is probably going to already go outside and say, okay, I don't need to do any of the directives that keep me safe. I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. And the tzaddik says, I'm a tzaddik, I'm doing everything correctly as much as possible. I can walk out there and be okay. No, that's not the situation. There's no differentiation made between the two. And in fact, this seems to point out that the tzaddik will be taken first. Meaning that if the hard time comes, the tzaddik happens first. And we see that with COVID right now, that there are situations where people who are keeping the Torah correctly but are lacking in maybe one area where they say, okay, there's no such thing, I don't believe in it, or I'm going to do whatever I want. And even if they're a tzaddik and they're only making a few mistakes in the Torah, they'll go first because of the fact that they are not standing on the principles that are mentioned here. Continuing in this same Masechet Bava Kama, essentially what it says is Le'olam yechanes adam b'chi tov v'yetzeh b'chi tov. Shene'amar, and he's quoting Shemot Yud Bet again, Exodus 12 again. V'atem lo tetzeu ish mipetach beto ad boker. So it continues and says, Devar be'ir kenes reglecho, shene'amar v'atem lo tetzeu ish mipetach beto ad boker, v'omer, and he's quoting Yeshayahu 26. It says, L'cha ami בא לחדרך וסגור בדלתך בעדך ואומר, and then he quotes דבורים, or Deuteronomy 32, מחוץ ותשחל חרב ומחברים. So essentially, this part of the Talmud talks about this issue where if a person was in a city where, for example, there is like a megifa, which is like a type of, if you can almost like say if there's a situation where someone is in a city where there's sickness and where there's this and that and destruction or difficult times, and if the call goes out, stay in your homes, then the person must stay in their homes, and essentially, um, it would be like, close yourself in, protect yourself by staying inside. Don't go outside and think, okay, well, I keep the Torah, and I'm going to be okay, I'll walk out there and just do whatever. No, the call comes out, stay in your homes, stay in your homes. Do what it takes to protect yourself. Don't walk out there thinking that somehow you're like, if you will, in the English language, a righteous person and that nothing's going to touch you because you're righteous. No, that's the opposite approach to the Torah. And interestingly enough, the Shulchan Aruch actually mentions, has kind of a commentary on this, and it says, this is a Yoreh De'ah, Kuf Tet Zan, which is like 116, section 5, and it says, "V'chen yizaher mechol davorim hamevi'im liyadei sachana, כי סחנתו חמירו מאיסורו ויש לחוש יותר מספק לסכנת ולספק איסור. עוד כתבו שיש לברוח מן העיר, כשדבר בעיר יש לצאת מן העיר בתחילה הדבר ולא בסופו. And it says, it continues, וכל אלו הדבורים הם המשום סכנה ושומר נפשו, ירחק מהם ואיסור לסמוך אנס או לסכן נפשו, בכל כיוצא בזה, והעיין בחושן המשפט, סימן Zan. So essentially what this translates into is that basically it's a warning that's given. And it says that a person, basically a Jewish person, but also this is something that can be taken outside of the Jewish world, is not supposed to put themselves in danger. And a person is supposed to avoid danger, to do whatever they can to avoid danger when it's known that there's something that's dangerous. And essentially what it says is that that if there's a situation that one sees that is danger that's coming to the city, a person has to escape the city before it takes place. If not wait until the end and say, oh, here's the danger, now time to go. Essentially that, okay, there's danger on the way, there's sickness on the way, there's destruction on the way. It's time to get out of here, and it's not time to wait until that happens and say, okay, now it's time to leave. And he basically explains that a person is supposed to protect themselves, protect their souls, and remove themselves or distance themselves from anything that is considered to be dangerous. And this is something that is, basically, expounded upon in different levels of Jewish thought about this issue of protecting one's life, and that one is not supposed to run towards danger when there's ability to get away from the danger. It's a little bit different when a person's trying to save someone's life. That's something completely different. If you literally have the ability to save someone's life, that's something completely different. But if it's a matter of, okay, a person looking and saying, okay, there's this, virus that's out there supposedly, I don't know if I believe it. I'm just going to do whatever I can, do whatever I want. Hashem will protect me. No, wrong. Hashem may protect you, but you don't know that. You don't know what the reason, what the basic how would you say, like the Makor in English would say, but like basically you don't know where this is coming from, you don't know where it's going. You see something that's dangerous, you get out of there before the danger starts, and that you prepare yourself before the danger starts. And that's also another way of looking at it. So a different perspective on living and survival. Now, when I was trying to come up with how to present this, because a lot of this came from a discussion I saw about someone asking the question of why is it that people would praise a creator who would cause or create corona, and they were quoting the pasuk I gave earlier for Yeshayahu about what Hashem does. So one of the things I think that is hard to understand in modern Western society is the idea of what benefit we have as a as a society, as humans, to have a planet that has so many natural resources on it, that we don't have to go to other planets to try to get resources, and that, if you will, there's so much light already established on this planet. There's so much completeness on this planet that we already have the ability to survive, a lot of what is found on this planet. including some of the difficult things and the challenges that happen. And that's one of the reasons that I think that people in modern society often kind of, I think, cry a little bit more about difficulties more than, let's say, for example, who come from more traditional societies, people who've been living a certain way for thousands of years, who have survived, and continue to survive for every moment, meaning that no meal is like just given to them. No meal is easy. There's no such thing as let's go to the grocery store and buy a packaged meal. No, every meal comes from something that we either have to raise ourselves, hunt ourselves, establish ourselves. And these societies often have a better outlook on dealing with the reality and how they survive than the most people in the Western world, in the modern world, if you will. And it makes you kind of question, well, who's really the sane person? Is it the person who can look around and say, okay, this is my environment. I'll survive based upon what I have. And my father taught me how to survive. His father taught him how to survive. And my mother taught me this. My grandmother taught me this. And you have a situation where, like you see the woman on the top left lugging up a bunch of like pieces of wood. I was in Ethiopia once and I saw women walking up hills with loads of like trees on them, things that I couldn't even carry that far. But they were just doing it because there was no other choice. And this is something they've been doing for thousands of years. And you have like the Sinhalese people, like in that island that's not far from India, where they don't even want Westerners to show up on their island. They're basically like, just don't even come here. And they are very violent to anybody who tries to get on their island. And it could be for the reasons we're discussing now about Corona, things like that they've had experience. That the minute these outsiders show up, they bring diseases with them, and people start getting sick. So no, you stay away. We'll stay over here, and we'll survive the way our ancestors have been doing it for thousands of years. So that even brings into the idea of the environment. There's people around the world who look at their environment as a resource, a resource that has to be used properly in order to get the maximum amount of usability out of it as well as the survivability out of it. So there's people who can survive in the desert, and it's not a big deal for them to do that. There's people who survive in the jungle, there's not a big deal for them to do that. There's people who survive in, frozen in tundras and things like that, and it's not a big deal for them to survive it because that's what they just have to do. That's what the situation is, and that's the reality, and they accept that reality. So then that brings us to, well, what about natural disasters? Well, same thing. There's people who deal with like, the fact that there's no water, there's droughts, there's people who deal with hurricanes and tsunamis and tornadoes, and they survive them. That may mean we don't build our houses over there near that ocean over there because there may be a hurricane. We don't, over use our resources. We don't over farm. And if you do, then you're in a lot of bad luck. We build things in a certain way to where if it gets taken up by a tornado, we just rebuild it all over again. We know what times of the year these things happen. We know when to maybe move somewhere else for a while and then come back. All of these are things that some of these societies, know how to deal with. There are societies that know, okay, these animals over here are dangerous. Don't touch them. Don't play with them. Don't eat them. There are some of them that said, okay, these things are dangerous in this way, but we can use them for these purposes. So there's someone who might say, in order for me to either hunt or trap something, I'm going to use this animal that has a certain poison in it or a certain toxin in it, and I'll use that to my benefit. And I'll survive it. And I'll deal with it. There are people around the world who know, okay, these plants, don't eat them. Don't stay, stay away from them. Don't touch them. Don't use them or use them in this way for these, medicinal purposes. There's people who've spent time figuring these things out because this is the world we live in, and this is what we've been given. And this is the Torah perspective, the perspective of the Torah. The perspective of the Torah is that it was given for the benefit of the people of Israel, so that we would know how to deal with the environment and the realities, no matter which direction it comes from. And it's actually one of the reasons that there have been, even after the exiles, that Jews have been exiled to different locations and been able to survive in those locations because they used information from the Torah to build a society and then learn how to survive it as much as possible. And interestingly enough, there have been situations where certain Jewish societies that walked away from the Torah didn't survive certain situations because they didn't have the tools that were there to protect them. So seeing the forest from the trees, let's look at a couple of situations going back to our original point. So when we get to the question of why did Hashem, create COVID-19? Well, I think one of the problems that I had with this question when I first looked at it is, okay, well, first of all, who says that Hashem created COVID-19? There is a number of theories about the origin of COVID-19, and I'm not going to say which one. I don't hold by any one. It could be any one of them. I have no idea, and I'll probably never know where exactly this thing came from. One idea that it does exist is that basically it started from like an animal base. Essentially, what that would mean is that people potentially may the jump from COVID from animals to people may have happened because of maybe certain types of contact that people have with certain types of animals, whether that be like animals that are wild animals that always maybe had something like this. Maybe COVID has existed since for thousands of years, but until people started doing A, B, C, and D, maybe it wasn't active amongst people. It could be that COVID was active between animals and people, but as long as people who were in contact with certain animals lived in certain places and essentially never moved or migrated or had contact with other people, then it wouldn't have spread anywhere else outside of that group of people. And it could be that for example, by them doing what they were doing or whatever, that their societies either survived it, didn't survive it, or just kind of dealt with the balance, of the reality. Um, there's some people who say, for example, that maybe COVID was cooked up in some lab somewhere. Who knows? I mean, I'm not saying either way, but maybe some lab was playing around with something they shouldn't have been playing around with, and then all of a sudden, something gets out, and then boom, the whole world's affected by the fact that everybody's so interconnected nowadays, and people have the ability to travel here and there, and it could be that countries that looked early enough and said, okay, wait a minute, something's not right, close the borders, self-sustain, you know, don't let anything in here, until we figure this thing out. And even after that, don't let anything in. Those countries may have been the ones that were the better prepared when, this thing was going all over the place. Because I remember when the first reports of COVID started coming out, I personally wondered, okay, maybe is this something in the air? Maybe how's it getting from place to place? And then one day I saw a video that showed when the cruises ships were getting it, or the people on cruise ships were getting it, how this one cruise ship, there were people who had it, were diagnosed with it, or and this is before it was fully understood what it was. And in some cases, there were people who were getting sick with it, who were put on planes and sent places, and then they just let them go wherever they were going to go. So then, it makes sense. And here's the thing that I find kind of strange. There have been a lot of movies in the last, I would say 15, 20, maybe even 30 years that have been kind of putting this thing out there like that. I mean, like there's a movie called 12 Monkeys with Bruce Willis in it that had an idea where some guy takes something out of a lab and spread this disease that took out a huge portion of humanity by just spreading it around on his own. He just wanted to do it. Um, I think there was a number of movies I've seen recently. I mean, you could even say like World War Z. I mean, there's a lot of movies that came out that deal with pandemics, contagion, outbreak. So there's also a theory that some people have that says, wait a minute, something's not right about this. Why were all these movies coming out with these scenarios? Again, I'm not, only like somewhat of a conspiracy theorist, but to a certain degree. I think that there are things in the world. I mean, you could even say, okay, well, right now with global warming, the polar ice caps are melting and things like that. Maybe there were diseases that were hidden under the ice. That if, as long as people didn't warm up the planet too much and just left things as they are, and then like let things work as they do, making as little footprint as possible, maybe we wouldn't. Maybe there's something stuck under the ice that wouldn't that melted, and all of a sudden you get stuff in the environment that wasn't there, before all that stuff started happening. I mean, it's hard to say, but this is the natural world we live in, and there's a lot more benefit to the world than there is negative stuff in the world. And I think that's the thing that's important. So this brings us to the point of dealing with what the text we were talking about says, where it says, Yotzer or say shalom. So let's look at this in a format of two different paths. On the left side here, just simply for the sake of it, you say, okay, that's the side of Yotzer or say shalom. So this is the side of creating light, and doing completeness or peace, if you will. So from this side, what things can we determine? When someone, for example, takes care of like the animal world in the right way and manages our existence and abilities as human beings with the animal world in the right way. Maybe that's a prime situation for the right things to happen in the world. Maybe when people have the right concepts in terms of agriculture, farming, sustainable housing, around the world. Maybe this is a part of Yotzer Or, and I'll say Shalom. Maybe when people, for example, create housing that doesn't like just pack people in like sardines into one area and spread things out. I mean, this is an example of the Earthship concept, and I think I've mentioned before, where essentially people, and there's a place called Taos, Mexico, New Mexico, where they have been performing and also teaching people how to build what's called an Earthship, which are houses that are basically used like waste materials that humans get rid of, like garbage, like tires, using bottles, cans, things like that, to basically build houses and making them self-sufficient, so that, for example, they gain water, from water that's, from rain. Then you get electricity from solar panels and maybe wind, and essentially they're off the, these can be off the grid. And essentially, maybe it's better for humans to live more spread out than they are like right packed on top of each other. And in environments like this, it's easier to manage and maintain if a pandemic does happen, because people can separate themselves a lot easier. So maybe this is an example of Yotzer Or, I'll say Shalom, taking what's naturally here or what we humans create, to be here, and using it for the good. Maybe another example is when people take, the desert and turn it into, like an oasis, if you will, by using the solar energy that it already exists, by, planting things that help, provide, for areas where, at one point there was a desert, now they're making the desert bloom. Here in Israel, that's been happening, where there's been a push to turn the Negev desert in the south of the country into, an oasis in some areas. And essentially, that's another example of Yotzer Or, Al Shalom. So the basic principle here is that there are ways already in existence that the creator put in place for us to basically take the resources that he created in the universe, if you will, and basically, do Yotzer Or, say Shalom, essentially that people can learn to live in the environment, but the problem that, and again, before, getting to the next side of it, you could even say with the current situation, it's quite possible that a lot of the cases of death and also people getting sick with corona could be prevented by simply keeping a big distance between people and wearing masks. I mean, there's been people who've been saying that if people just wore masks and, like kept a, social distance, that maybe you could reduce a lot of the injury and pain. And that's a way of Yotzer Or say Shalom. And that's the optimal situation, which is, using the environment correctly and also managing yourself and other people and your contacts with other people correctly. So now we have the other side of things. We have Uvurei Hoshech, Uvurei Ra. So essentially, this the perspective that we have as Jews is that, the Creator has given us the ability to go to either direction. So we've dealt with the one side, now let's deal with the other side of it. So maybe one reason that you have this situation is because of the fact that you have people who are so packed together, and you have a situation where cities are so cramped, and and the traffic is so much, and you have high levels of pollution around the world, and overusage of industrialized systems of water, electricity. So you have a situation where maybe those are part of Uvurei Hoshech, Uvurei Ra, meaning from nothing. Comes this situation where the planet is being overpopulated and overused, and the resources are not being used properly. So you have a situation where the opposite is there, meaning again, the Creator has given us the ability to go one direction or the other. Both, or if you will, because of the fact that creation or reality exists, we can choose either one, but we're the ones who initiate the choice of either one. So another example of this is like, social unrest, people fighting over things, people, polluting. And in some cases, it's not people, but it's more like the industries of a few, which create these situations where, for example, you start polluting the waters, you start deforesting things, you start, doing things to animals, you start putting chemicals all over the place. You basically you use your logic the wrong way. And this is an example of maybe that causes uvorei choshech, uvorei ra. So essentially these two situations are the options that are created when people don't manage the reality that we're created in correctly. So one principle that you could say, okay, as an example, is that one of the reasons that some scientists believe that, for example, the polar ice caps are melting is because of global warming, and there's been people who say, okay, there's no such thing. There's people who say, okay, it doesn't matter if we pollute, it doesn't matter if we put things in the ocean, in the sky, all these things, so be it, so what? Well, that attitude may be also part of Uvurei Choshech, Uvurei Ra, that, basically we've been given the ability to, basically darken the earth, if you will, and create evil, if we will. And as I mentioned in a previous video, It depends on how far humanity wants to go with this whole thing. If we've been given the keys to this planet, and right now you have people talking about going to Mars and other planets, but this one scientist I think said it best. He was a physicist. He said, okay, well, the technology that it would take to get humans to outer space and to colonize other planets is about the same technology and effort to fix the things that are wrong on our planet right now. And he was saying that, okay, look, it's fine if you want to go to space, that's perfectly fine, but there's a whole bunch of things here that we could fix using that same energy and technology and also resources. So the idea of terraforming another planet that is inhospitable to human life currently, if you can do that, why can't you fix the problems of this planet now? But again, that's a choice that we make. So you can even bring that back to we were talking about Corona. Well, you have a situation where there are people who choose not to social distance, choose not to wear masks, and have events together, and then sometimes they have what they call a super spreader, and that's a choice that people make. So there are some people who are trying to social distance, trying to basically protect themselves and others. But if there are more people, or a lot of people, or even a few people who choose not to, they are basically a part of this process of uvrei choshech, uvrei ra. You know, at what point is a decision made that, for example, um, people who decide to, not do the right thing, in terms of protecting the environment, protecting the other people, protecting themselves, what do you do about that? And what do you actually create from that? And how do we blame the creator for something that people are choosing to do? Because the reality is that most people don't want the creator stepping into their lives every time they do something incorrect, wrong, or hurtful to other people. Most people want to be able to walk around and say, I'm not wearing a mask. You can't make me wear a mask. But what if wearing a mask, for example, were the thing that saves someone else's life? Well, there's some people who say, I don't care about his life. I don't care about, some people are like, I don't care about my own life. It's like, for example, saying, well, why do people smoke cigarettes? So some people want to smoke and they don't care if they're polluting the earth by doing it. They don't care if they're hurting someone else who may have asthma or whatever. There's some people who say, look, I'm in danger myself. So what? It doesn't matter to you. And someone say, well, it affects me, and it matters to me, maybe what happens to you. And someone says, don't worry about me. Well, that's hard to do when you have a situation as the reality is that humans have created, and that's something that's a part of this process. So then that brings us to the point of, okay, well, what's the result of Urei Choshech Uvrei Ra? One of them is that in this world, in this time frame of life, for example, that a person lives, that we are affected by the actions of ourselves and others. We're not just, again, if unless a person can live as far away from society as possible, or do like some of the tribes I mentioned earlier who separate themselves from society, there's a deep connection that some people have, especially in the modern world. So one thing affects another. So this is one of the reasons that I would say that a person can't really go and say, okay, well, if the creator of all things, creates the ability, creates good and evil, we should blame the creator for that. Well, again, human beings, currently want the situation, or else we would have a completely different world society or societies, if you will. Again, if we want the creator to come in and stop all of this stuff, we also have to be willing to give away a lot of freedoms for that to happen. And this is what's actually interesting. There's a concept amongst Torah Moshe that when Adam, or in English you call him Adam, when the first man and woman existed on the planet, that essentially when they made the decision they made, many of you've heard the basics of the story, at least of the English version of it, of Adam and Eve, or Adam or of the Hawa, as in Hebrew it's called. And one of the concepts is that when Adam made his choice to basically eat of the fruit, and again, this is a basic, like concept of the story. The story is a lot deeper in terms of Torah Moshe than what people know in the Western world. But that essentially, he wasn't making the decision and cursing all of humanity. There's one concept I once heard that is as if all of humanity that will exist was in him at the time, and that we all made the choice together. So it'd be like saying that throughout history, humans didn't want a situation where the creator provided the perfect situation where there was no thought process into doing the right thing, that there was no choice but to do the right thing, but that essentially humans wanted to be able to choose. I want to either do the right thing or do the wrong thing, and the creator created a reality that allows for either one to happen. So if we keep the mitzvot, we keep the things that the creator gave, well, then we're dealing with yotzer or ve'oseh shalom. But if a person chooses not to do those things or do the opposite, again, also including not staying in when they're supposed to stay in, not staying away from danger, not, treating the environment correctly, creating bad situations and mentalities, then we bring, that we create that aspect because we're part of the creation, if you will. So This brings it to the idea. Okay, well, this idea of like, like that's used of like or and hoshech, light and dark. So one way of looking at it is a person can easily say, okay, there's a light, it's dark in here, let me go towards the light. I'm going to head towards the light. It's warm. It's, it's this and that. I'm able to deal with my problems better in the light. I'm able to face challenges better in the light. If a disease comes about, we can fix it a lot easier. Let's spend all of our money rather than on weapons, on helping humanity, on improving the medical situation. All of a sudden a corona thing pops up. Oh, we've got this. There's a corona outbreak. Close the borders. Here's the disease control. Get everybody wearing masks. Get everybody galvanized. You're the leaders. You lead by example. People aren't doing A, B, C, and D. You be the first to do it. People don't want to do it. We got some something to deal with that. When people, the disease happens, most of our money is spent on medical. We face it in this way. Okay, here's the things that led us to this point. Stop doing those things. This is the way that the concept of Torat Moshe works about looking at how to deal with adversity, because the reality is that we live in an adverse world, and that's by our own choosing. But there are methodologies that that we can do to basically deal with those realities. But again, it's a choice that me by myself, for example, I couldn't make that choice. It would require people around us, people in the world, to choose those things. There's also the option a person can say, I want to go as far away from the light as possible. I want to go as far into the darkness as possible. And this brings up a concept of that essentially, in order for there to be light, you have to have some element of darkness, meaning that if a person goes further and further away from the light and says, wow, it's really dark over here, I don't like how dark it is, let me go back to the light. The ability to know how good the light was comes from the darkness. That sometimes people don't know how good the light is until they see how difficult it is in the dark. Someone says, okay, I don't like the lights being on, turn the lights out. Well, now I can't see anything, I can't feel anything. What was that? Who just touched me? Did I hear something? These are the kind of things that a person experiences in darkness. And essentially, this one rabbi put it this way, that you could look at the darkness as being like the cup, and the light being the water. In a sense, the cup for the light is the darkness, if you will. And if there's light, essentially, it's contained by the darkness. So see, you could say, okay, well, once I had a discussion with somebody about dark matter, one of the concepts of dark matter is it's considered to be almost like the thing that holds the universe together. Where most of it would be dark matter if it does exist, because it's all theoretical. And then the material that it's being held together by is at the minimum, but it's essentially what holds the things together. So this is the concept and the way that we would look at it. In conclusion, the basic principles that I've been talking about here is that the idea is that we have a choice as human beings. We can choose one direction or the other, and it depends on what we want. If we want a world that operates in a certain way, then we can choose it to operate that way or choose not to. Not all things are like, punishment from the creator. There's some things that are just simply the choices we make open up the doors to certain realities, and we can choose the opposite direction, or we can go straight right into it and choose the one that's maybe not the optimal one for us. The ability to destroy things, completely is there. The ability to increase and be able to cause things to go the right way is also there. And that's a choice, so the creator of all things created the choice of darkness or light. It's just a matter of what do we choose to fill the things up with. If it's like saying a cup, I can fill up my cup with poison, or I can fill it up with like, something that's healthy and good for me, like water. So again, it's a choice. I can choose to drink Kool-Aid, or, like soda, or I can choose to drink water. I can choose to, basically build the world anyway. And there's other people who make those choices for us. There's some situations where if I try to get water from an industrialized system, somebody could put stuff in my water that I don't want there, but I don't control the system. They do. So they're making choices that affect me. Unless I decide to go out on my own, which is personally something I'm looking into. About maybe trying to build an Earthship somewhere. Essentially, that's the only way that a human being could, be able to control their destiny. And you would think that most societies in the world would encourage people to not be a part of the systems, for example, meaning that you encourage people to accept the light rather than the darkness, meaning that, we don't need to pack people into big cities and then say, okay, here's the electricity. Oh, it's out now, joke's on you, you got to survive whatever way you can. And instead, maybe go out and teach people and say, okay, look, if you're going to live in this kind of environment, we as the government are going to teach you how to survive in that environment. We are going to teach you how to be as independent as possible, and only if you want to, for us to make that choice for you, or need us, will we provide it for you. But here, provide for yourself. I mean, you could imagine what an initiative would look like if, like, cities started teaching people how to get electricity on their own. about how water collection. There's a lot of places that get so much rain, but a lot of it's wasted water because it doesn't go to the average use of the person. These are the kind of ways that society could be modeled after or work upon, but it's just a choice that people make. So in conclusion, essentially, what this basic verse is basically saying is that Hashem has created a situation where we as humans have the ability to take what's been given to us, take the resources, and create light from them and create completeness with them. Or we can have a situation where we can create something new that doesn't have to be here, which is the opposite, the dark side of things, if you will, or the things that aren't so good or good to our existence. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and I thank you for listening. Take care.